those places. We really appreciate it and the support you give us each week for subscriptions and likes and all those kind of things and reviews. Thank you very much for listening last week, actually, because I came on, did a bit of a solo run at just talked a bit and was kind of semi-coherent and but it was a fun one because it took a lot of work to do, and I kind of sometimes you have to do a bit of work because I'm relying on the guests far too much, but they're more interested than I am, so that's good. But let's get into our episode this week. Our guest is a lecturer of neuroscience at Bristol University, and her name is Emma Cahill.
Correct.
Emma, I nearly messed it up there. And do you know, it's the Irish, you're Irish.
Yes.
And it's that pronunciation that the English use, Cahill. And I think I hear that more now. And it's probably through maybe footballers or, I'm not too sure. So I was thinking about this, better ask. And then I nearly messed it up, but I got it right.
You got it right, but don't worry about it. I did a whole conference once as Dr. Chill because of a typo. So
Dr. Chill, that must now. There's definitely a character called Dr. Chill somewhere. So
must be.
But listen, Emma, we'll start where we always do. Could you give us a short history of your upbringing, please?
Sure. So I'm from County Waterford, from a small village called Faithleg. Again, where maybe the English pronunciation of an Irish place name has gone a bit wrong, but. It's a really small village. I mean, in my school, it was, 9 or 10 people per class, and the teacher had 3 classes in the one room. So kind of country, not a lot going on, but in a way it's kind of good. It throws different, kids together and you make your friends locally like that, and a lot of outdoor stuff going on. I did sort of, funnily enough, I think it was a pretty normal country school. My parents were actually from Dublin, so I was kind of always up and down to see family up there. And I was, raised Catholic and all that, and involved in doing the mass readings and altar girl, all that sort of things, which I do think actually, funnily enough, helped for lecturing.
Right.
I wasn't as frightened as I might have been about public speaking by the time I was a teenager, funnily enough. But yeah, that's the background, country.
And did you, because you obviously had the experience then of both, if you were in Waterford, but then you were traveling up and down to Dublin, and what would be, I've asked a few people this actually, what would be your preference?
Waterford.
Right. Do you prefer just the quiet?
I do. I like countryside.
Right.
I mean, I've lived in cities. I did my PhD in Paris, and I've been, sort of. I think the thing about small villages is you kind of have this sense of knowing who's around, even if you're not close to them. The families, the kind of history of the place. You feel kind of a connection to it, perhaps a bit more than somewhere which is a capital that can be a bit more transitory. So I like that aspect of it. But I mean, I moved to Cambridge, then I moved to Bristol, and there's advantages in different places, a lot more going on.
Yeah. I think that the real bonus for me, I travel up to Dublin. My mom lives up in Dublin, so I travel up there a bit. And there is that idea when I talk about anxiety, it's quite, there's a lot of people around and it's moving fast and all that stuff. But on the flip side of it, it's also the anonymity, the fact that like you can go there and know that, if you're not feeling like talking to someone, you go there and you're not going to bump into someone. And I kind of like that, but I live in the country now, and I would definitely prefer it because of the quiet and just the, everybody waves at each other. I don't know. I just like that kind of thing. But so always ask, the second question is always, Emma, when did you first become aware of mental health?
Yeah, this is actually something that I was thinking about, because I don't think I consciously became aware of mental health till very late in life, because I think I would have actually come across it more as a mental illness. The extreme end of the scale. And then when I was thinking about, when was I kind of exposed to this, the most acute incident, unfortunately, like many people, I had a friend who committed suicide as a teenager. So that's the sort of, acute episode where you're aware of how extreme things can go. But then I was thinking about, well, actually, in fairness, in school, even without thinking about it, a lot of the literature and the arts that we do are talking about extremes of emotions, like I know it's not people's favorite thing, but even on Trial that I did in Irish, it's, spoiler alert, doesn't end well, which is true of a lot of Irish literature, actually.
Yeah.
And even in English, I was thinking about like poems I remember are sort of like, I can't even remember who wrote it, like the one about Stop All the Clocks, when someone's partnered, I think it might have been Wordsworth or somebody, but their partner has died. And so maybe, at the time I probably would have thought, oh, this is just grief, or this is just a social situation for this woman that becomes pregnant. But actually they're probably the first time people start to show you different cases of mental health and different perspectives on it. It's probably coming from the arts. Yeah.
It's you're actually the first person to kind of bring it up in that sense, and it's interesting when you think of literature, for instance. And my favorite book it still is my favorite book, but when we were reading it in school, was To Kill a Mockingbird. And obviously Boo Radley's character was never talked about mental health in the book, but obviously there was something with Boo Radley with regards to mental health, but he was seen as kind of the scary guy, down the end of the street. We all had that when we were young as well, I think. But if we lived in an estate or something, or even out in the country, there was always a house where you like didn't really want to go past, and there wasn't a conversation about mental health, so it was never open to maybe your parents saying to you, well, that's the situation there is. It was always just the scary kind of the guy or the lady down the end of the street. And it's interesting to know back, especially as you mentioned with Irish literature, it's pretty grim, at the best of times. But that's a great answer. So Emma, so this is, I think I'm allowed one really, really broad question per episode. I give myself that. So what is neuroscience?
So neuroscience is the study of the brain and behavior associated with it, we believe. I mean, neuroscience is very obviously brain focused, because the brain cells are typically called neurons or neurons, depending on who you ask. But it's not just neurons, there's other cells there, of course, as well, glia, which are really overlooked. But basically, it deals more with the physiology, like how the brain works, rather than the older science, psychology, which would be more the study of behavior.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out what drives different behavior or different traits in different situations. But what I think is quite exciting is that nowadays neuroscience and psychology are very close together. So you'd have people that say they are cognitive neuroscientists. So they study cognition, which is our, ability to recognize, to think, decision make. And in fairness, they're studying the same processes that experimental psychologists have studied for years. So it's a good time to study it, because there's this convergence of two fields, which for a long time were quite separate. And if you go back even further, I mean, philosophy would have been the original people to study the mind and that sort of angle. So neuroscience is probably, I think it would be fair to say, it's the baby of experimental psychology.
Yeah, because we've talked about psychology on here. We've had different people in the profession to speak about mental health, and the study of mental health, and even going to a psychologist, and there's so many different types of therapy that we've had on, and it's interesting, but we haven't really dug deep into neuroscience. So that's what's it's great about having you on. What was it actually that attracted you to neuroscience?
I think I went into sciences. I did natural sciences, where you had a choice, because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I wanted options. And then when it came second year into uni of picking what your specialism was, I kind of thought to myself, the most interesting thing to me are people. So people have brains, hence neuroscience will be interesting.
Good, yeah.
Although animals have brains too, but I don't know. I mean, I liked zoology, but yeah, I think that's why I kind of went along the line of, I think it was also quite, probably marketed is the wrong word, but it was probably, presented as quite a new science as well. I think at the time there were kind of only 2 degrees in Ireland where you could do neuroscience. So that kind of made it exciting as well, that it was this new subject. And then when I got into it, I did again like that thing that you have the biology, you can kind of understand how do cells work, how do they make changes and adapt. And then you ultimately, most of the time, want to read out a behavior that you can see, so you can try and understand how different organisms act in their environment. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, and what was the route then? Like, where was the first college or university you went to?
Yeah, I went to Trinity. I did natural sciences there. Yeah, I was absolutely delighted to get in. I remember the day the postman arrived. I still remember the CAO code was TR071. I was absolutely ecstatic when I got it. And I had a great experience there. I mean, I was all right. I wasn't a stellar student or anything. But in my final year, there was a chance to do research. So you went into a lab. My supervisor was Dr. Anya Kelly. So she studies physiology of exercise and how that affects memory. So I did a research project looking at if rats were exercised, would they have better memory for objects? Okay. And I found that was so interesting because I thought, you know, oh, like it's interesting to hear about things in lectures, but then you actually go and you do it and you realize the holes in our knowledge, what we don't know, and that you can actually see something for the first time or figure out little bits of the problem, and the practical side of it as well. You kind of plan your own day, run experiments, analyze data, and that sort of thing. So that really got me interested in research as an actual line of something to follow.
So we're going to obviously talk more about what you you know, what you research and what you dig down into, but I just want to kind of touch on this before we go into it. Like, when we're talking about something like mental health, and we can kind of stick to maybe anxiety or depression, like either, you know, because it's very broad and we don't need to go into everything, I suppose. But what, in your kind of research, like what happens to the brain in the situation when somebody is quite anxious about something?
Yeah, this is really interesting because one of the questions that I'm really interested in is, how is the anxious brain different from the fearful brain? Like, what's the difference between fear and anxiety? And I think this is where it's really interesting to speak to people, to humans, because obviously I work with animals mostly. But the thing is that the way we formalize it now is we think that anxiety is the brain's response when it's not sure about where the threat is coming from. It's a response to a potential threat. So interestingly enough, there seems to be brain areas that become active, which are different from the brain areas that become active in fear. And fear is the response when you have an obvious threat, where you're kind of aware, like, I have to react now. So classically, everyone thinks of the amygdala as being a brain area which is really important for emotion. And it is, and it's activated by fearful stimuli. But interestingly, there's an extended bit of the amygdala, which has a really awful name, the bed nuclei of the stria terminalis. Okay. So yeah, we just call it the BNST for short. And the BNST, interestingly enough, becomes activated when people are shown things that are potential threats. Okay. So there's this difference. So it could be that there are different circuits in the brain that have evolved to deal with potential uncertain, unpredictable threat versus something that's obvious and you need to respond instantly. Right. But in terms of the cells that are activated or the neurotransmitters that are involved, it's a lot less clear, because you have to make a big leap between understanding the human experience of emotion and something that you can measure in a simpler, inverted commas, organism that is like an anxiety behavior. And it's a big jump, you know. So you have to try and figure out whether you can measure something like that and then figure out at the cellular level what's happening in the brain.
I love the fact, because you mentioned it already, it's one of the newer, you know, sciences. And it must be, for someone like yourself who's so enthusiastic about it, it must be such an exciting thing to work in because of the newness and, I guess, how much we can find out about the brain.
It is. I think in saying that, you know, I actually find myself quite often going back to older studies that they may not have called themselves neuroscientists. They might have said they were physiologists, you know, just studying how the body works. Yeah. And there's some really interesting work. And same with psychology. There's some excellent, really early experiments in the 50s and 60s in psychology, which are still massively influential. So it is new, but the exciting bit of the science probably comes from newer techniques we have. So we've got much more of a mastery now about how to actually figure out what brain areas involved, not by just damaging them and then saying, oh, look,
Yeah.
the animal can't do it anymore, so that bit's important. Now we have techniques that use viruses, and these viruses encode, or they make little proteins that can activate or stop cells.
Yeah.
So you can locally control an area without permanently damaging it. So in real time, you can control behavior, which is cool.
But and like, I guess all this, I suppose this is a pretty obvious thing to say, but like the advance in technology as well is the huge leap that you're able to make now.
Yes, exactly. It's also influenced even the words we use. Like you heard me maybe just say encode there, and that's because, you know, the people working in the 50s and 60s, a lot of them, they would have come right out of working post World War II on signals and information processing. So you have this whole influence about technology giving the words to neuroscience. So we say encoding, we say information storage, we say processing for this, something that this, you know, the brain isn't really a computer. It doesn't work digitally. It's not zeros and ones. It's an analog machine with levels of things being important. But we use the terminology from the tech.
Yeah, it's cool though. I like it. I don't know, but I'm just going to read out a quick advert, Emma, if you don't mind, and we'll get back into it. Sometimes I explain why I put an LP behind me every episode. And sometimes I explain, and the reason I put "What's Going On" by Marvin Gaye is because, like, literally, like, I don't know what's going on with neuroscience. You see, there's a link there sometimes, but there's no question mark on the end of "What's Going On," which has always been I've never understood why there's not on the end of this album cover. But yeah, sometimes there's links, sometimes they're tenuous, but I think this one is a pretty obvious one. But anyway, that's not the advert, by the way. I'm not advertising Marvin Gaye's album from 1967 or whatever. So, Fusion Training Center, Monksland Athlone, a place to train in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, kickboxing, martial arts, and CrossFit. A great atmosphere with experienced coaches and a real sense of community. If you want to join the team, find us on Facebook at Fusion Training Center or drop in for a chat. Fusion Training Center, train like a warrior. So that's that done. Check that off the list. So how did your research into memory and learning, because I know that's what your field is, how did that come about?
So in my as I said, in my undergrad research, I was interested in object recognition memory and how that was influenced. So I started thinking about when I was studying for a PhD, what sort of types of learning or memory I could look at. And it's not maybe obvious, but then I actually went down a path of looking at how cocaine affects the brain.
Okay.
And one of the reasons for that is a major theory about addiction is that drugs of abuse actually take over the circuits of the brain that normally are used for learning and memory.
Okay.
So for that reason, I went to study how cocaine could actually make this really strong, lasting impact on the brain that overtakes behavior. And after that, then for my postdoctoral work, after my PhD, I flipped direction and said, well, what about stimuli which are not so rewarding, but are aversive? So I started to look at fear and how fear memories become so strong and lasting. So both of these stimuli, if you want to call them that, fearful things or drugs of abuse, they're called reinforcers. So they reinforce a particular behavior from happening. And that is really what we think is kind of supported by the same things in learning and memory. Yeah.
The thing about fear, okay, because I like this, because when you're starting to get to know someone, not like, or pretty quickly you'll find out or ask them what their greatest fear is, and a lot of people say heights, and a lot of people have similar fears. And I just want to ask you a little bit about that, because I've said this on this podcast before and people laugh at me, but I think it's very unfair. So my fear, I guess it's a fear, I don't really know what it is bananas. And when I see, and I don't know this, you might be able to help me with this actually, whether it's a fear or not, because it's like when I see them, I don't know if it's a little bit of fear or if I'm just repulsed by them, because it's one of those things where it's like, everything. People say, why do you not like bananas? And I say everything, like, the taste, the texture, everything to do with it, the skin, whatever. But I honestly think it's starting. Can you become afraid of something over time?
I think you could. I mean, theoretically, there's no reason why not. That what you're talking about, like being repulsed, would be typically described as disgust, which is one of the fundamental emotions. Fear is another one. So there were 6. So it's, joy, anger, fear, disgust. What's the other ones? Sadness. And there's something else. Surprise was in the original ones as well, but they dropped that later.
Oh.
Weirdly enough. So I think it's possible. I think people would laugh because it's meant to be an innocuous thing. In animal research, actually, one of the things people look at quite a lot is taste aversion. Conditioned taste aversion would be the technical term. And that basically means where an animal eats something and then has a bad experience, and then it will avoid that food for a long time. So there are models which kind of map onto this. But I think there's an interesting piece of work as well about what they call biological preparedness. So this is an idea that it's easier to become afraid of certain things, like you were saying, like heights or spiders or something, because we're biologically already prepared to be afraid of them. Like we've inherited over generations some sort of biological memory that it makes us quicker to condition or to learn to be afraid of a particular thing rather than something else, like a banana, which should be innocuous and shouldn't cause us any problems. So there's some really old influential work with monkeys, actually looking at that, trying to make them afraid of stimuli, and the animals were able to learn very quickly to react to a toy snake, but not to a bunch of flowers, even though the same kind of stimulus was used. So it's kind of this idea that you're pre-wired for certain things to be easier to learn.
Maybe I'll try that with like a bunch of flowers and a toy snake or something. I'll figure it out. I could, that's actually, listen to you speak about it, Emma. Maybe it is that idea of just being repulsed by it, and banana sandwiches when you were younger, which is sandwich is madness. It is absolutely. But even if you like bananas and you like bread, putting the two together is crazy. Anyway, but that was just my little thing. But so when you talk about illnesses, say memory loss and Alzheimer's and the illnesses that go along with them, how far have we come in studies with regards to, I guess, catching them early?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the difficulty with trying to catch things like Alzheimer's early is that they are disorders that generally happen in older people. And generally in older people, there's also something called mild cognitive decline anyway, that we all start to just not have as good memories as we get older. So you need something that's sensitive enough to be able to tell apart that natural decline in memory from what's happening in Alzheimer's. Now, I haven't kept up to date really with that literature that much, but I think one of the interesting things is the type of memories that become weakened in Alzheimer's disease tend to be sort of what we call episodic. So this ability to sort of relive or see it from your mind's eye memory, rather than facts and figures, which we call semantic memories. So be able to remember things like birthday, or who is the president or the Taoiseach or the prime minister, whatever. Things like that will remain. But I think it's tricky to pull apart those two things. So I think in terms of how far we've come, I guess there's a good push to sort of, at least if people are talking about it, like you started off this conversation about how we maybe didn't speak as much about mental health before in the past. I guess the earliest people can diagnose, you can start to put things in place to ease symptoms or to help people with their quality of life by putting things in place so that they have reminders, or they're able to do tasks they need. So even if it's not at the point of a cure, at least they're having an openness and a willingness to people to say that they feel like they're getting particularly forgetful will allow things to be caught earlier.
I think it's that and most people will have an experience within their family of dementia or Alzheimer's. And I think it's that thing of it's the same with mental health, that people they feel like maybe they're going to become some sort of a burden on other people, and they don't want to mention it. And then it becomes down the line where it becomes quite noticeable. And then, like you said, we haven't put anything in place. And then you're kind of trying to catch up with it a bit. I wanted to ask, and we mentioned this before I started recording, about the effect of anxiety on mental health. And I spoke to my friend about this, and he mentioned about the hyper focus, and it made a lot of sense to me, but I probably didn't explain it to him correctly or as well as I could have. But I was talking about, if I'm going into town, for instance, when quite anxious about it, that's all I'm focused on is the anxiety of it. And I get into town and I leave, I won't remember most of the trip to town. It becomes just that. That's what I guess he meant about hyper focus. How do you have you seen anything about that in regards to anxiety affecting memory?
Yeah, I think this is something that I've recently become very interested in because of this idea that you can have, so they might call it hypervigilance as a symptom. So you can have this sort of tendency to sort of either focus on a particular thing that is, in theoretical terms, it'd say potential threat or something like that, or just something that's stressful, but also this ability that you might, things that are not threats, people kind of interpret them as they might be. So this kind of vigilance, kind of looking for threat cues, or things that predict threat when it's actually a safe context and it's not necessary. I find this really interesting because typically in animal studies, when we're trying to figure out what might be underlying anxiety responses, a lot of the tasks we use, and for good reason, they use etiological measures, people would say, or measures that are kind of natural to the animal. So for example, sticking them in a maze, in a brightly lit maze, rodents are crepuscular, they like dawn and dusk and nighttime, so they'll stick to the dark areas, and you measure how much time they spend in the dark as a measure of how anxious they are. Okay. But that is actually, that's a behavior which is more like avoidance. They're avoiding going into the brightly lit area. And humans do show avoidance if they have anxiety. So you might not go into certain situations, or you might avoid certain scenarios or things. But as you say, there's a really important symptom, which is this focus on cues, trying to find them, which is the opposite of that. But I've been really interested now to see with animals, can we actually study about whether they become hyper aware of cues that potentially predict threat?
There's also this is another thing that I just thought of. It's the hyper. I get the vigilance and the idea of threat, because I do think about that a lot. Like, and in like you say, you go into a place where there isn't any obvious threat, but everything that you see around you could possibly be a threat, and you've led yourself down that kind of path. But there's some evenings where I might have to do something the next day where I might be quite anxious, and I'll be sitting in my room just on my own, watching, like, TV's on, watching a film or reading a book, because that'd be normally what I'd be doing. But say if I'm reading a book and I'm anxious, nothing will go in. Like, I'll get through 50 pages, nothing. If I watched a film when I'm anxious, I might you might ask about it the next day, and I will tell you I remember who was in it, and that's about it. And it's constant. It's the constant I suppose effort of trying to remain in the moment, but that anxiety is like calling all the time to kind of pull you out of it. And it's it's, look, I've talked about it with therapists and all that, but like, it's very interesting to hear what you're doing with animals, kind of find out what what it is with them, because it's a weird thing.
It reminds me of older ideas about stress. So maybe the people who were researching psychological stress back in the day, if we ask them now, they might find that their research was closer to potentially anxiety, because like, even, I can't remember what year, but late 1800s, there's this study of looking about attention and stress. So if you have too much of it, like you're saying, you don't encode the information. It's not going in. A little bit is good. A little bit of stress can actually help you to remember things.
Yeah.
So it's all about what they call this, like, inverted N curve. So it's like, an N shape, inverted U. So it's all about being in the right spot of a level of arousal or potentially anxiety. And some people will just be biologically vulnerable, that they've gone to the other end of the scale. Or even on the opposite, you could have too little arousal, and then you don't pay attention to anything and you don't focus, and it doesn't enter into a long-term memory.
Yeah.
So this idea is interesting, and it's similar in a way to, what people would call a cognitive bias. So it's sort of like weighing different information disproportionately. So as you say, you're in a safe context. There is a something there that you could be focusing on, but this other thing is dragging all the resources to it.
I like, this is the like, I've obviously come on a long way since, it was particularly bad a few years ago, and I've come a long way since. But it was always it's always more that I think about it and the ideas behind it of why we. I suppose I'm able to think about it now. Back then, I was worrying so much that I wasn't able to think about why this is happening, or the reasons for it, and be able to talk about it and stuff. But it's always been fascinating for me when I do have that anxiety. And we talk about fight or flight thing as well, and that's a huge. And I think it was a lot more flight back in the day, So I think now I'm able to kind of fight through it. But yeah, just the idea of being. Because, like you say, you have to have a little, so you have to learn how to sit in it and be a little bit comfortable in it, but at the same time be able to take in what you're trying to do around you. And I think I'm getting there. I'm getting there a bit. But there's another thing with memory, and again, look, because it's primarily a mental health podcast, we've talked about trauma quite a bit on it, and people. The things that set people off, or things that they might selectively forget certain parts of it, and other bits of it come back up. Is that something that you've have much kind of background in?
We've looked in the lab at how certain memories might be potentially weakened. So this is interesting for trauma, because not for all cases, but for some cases, like in PTSD, there might have been an event which you can actually time lock and say, all right, well, this is when things started to go wrong since that event. So one of the things we try and do is to figure out whether if you reactivate that memory, so if you make the person or the animal recall that type of memory, is there a way to rewrite it or sort of override the response to it? And this is not a million miles away, I think, from what happens in a lot of therapy. It's talking therapy, and you try and kind of rationalize or sort of change the emotional content around a situation. But what people have been trying to do from the neuroscience angle is understand what chemically happens when you recall that trauma memory. Could you mess with that chemical signals so that when the memory goes back into storage, it's stored weaker? So this is a really exciting area, which is called reconsolidation, because originally memories were thought to go through a kind of a linear path of being encoded, consolidated, and then lasting for as potentially your lifetime. But then it was actually discovered in the 60s, but it was kind of rediscovered in 2000, that if you recalled a memory and then you gave certain drugs which disrupt these chemical processes that let the memory become stored again, the animals didn't show the behavior anymore. So it was like there was an amnesia.
Wow.
And we don't think, now I think it's fair to say, we don't think it's completely erasing the memory, but there's a lot of active research in trying to understand this, because, as I said, it was sort of originally discovered a bit by accident. So we're not 100% clear about all the mechanisms that are involved, but that's an interesting therapeutic avenue. If you could couple therapy with some drugs that would be able to weaken the processes by which these memories are stored away again, you could have a better long-lasting effect for patients.
Wow. We had a film reviewer on recently, Lillian Crawford, and she was great, but she talked about trigger warnings and stuff, and that was kind of got me thinking about it again, because we've spoken to people who've had some horrible traumas in the past. But and when you're not thinking of something, you don't pick up on things, but when someone mentions about trigger warnings, then you hear them everywhere, and you hear them on podcasts. And Lillian made some great points about films, especially to do with streaming services and stuff, where they should be highlighted, because if you're going into a film and all of a sudden there's a horrible scene that reminds you of something that happened to you in the past, it can set you off. So it got me thinking about the trauma and stuff, and how it is being worked on and people are looking into it. And it's great that, like, the idea that it can be lessened. Lessened is such I guess it's kind of a very exciting thing for you and for people who are studying these things. But so what, like in where you are in Bristol University, is there like what size is is very exciting kind of time for the kind of neuroscience, because obviously that's a main part, and I know it's connected to Cambridge in some way as well.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a weird one because I still have an affiliation to Cambridge because I've just come to Bristol and I'm still giving some lectures in Cambridge because I have a PhD student there.
Okay.
So she's studying how animals learn about threats from each other. So sometimes that's true as well. You don't actually experience the trauma yourself, you witness it. But we know as humans, you can witness something bad and then you learn about it. And it's very different from the individual experiencing it. So that's what her work is on. And for that reason, I'm still going a little bit back and forth between the two. And in Bristol, it's been great so far. They've had a serious sort of drive to recruit more neuroscientists.
Right.
So there's a few of us that are new, and that's always nice as well because it makes a bit of dynamic sort of group, all learning about each other's research. I share an office with someone who's working on the other type of brain cell. As I mentioned, no one focuses on glia. So she's studying that with depression and actually mechanisms of drugs. Yeah, so serotonin and stuff like that. And then the other person in the office is looking at diseases like schizophrenia and the genetic component and trying to study that with mice to see what genetically has happened that's different in the brain. So it's great when you have this mix of different people because similar as what I said to you about speaking with people with lived experience, it just gives you new ideas and takes you out of your comfort zone about the way you think about your questions, which can become quite rigid if you're always looking for the data or the literature on the specific thing you're thinking of. I think it's really important for something like mental health that we do have this sort of broader scope and even interdisciplinary. You know, there's a great network in the southwest of England called GW4. So it's Cardiff, Exeter, Bath, and Bristol.
Right.
And we all kind of have potential then to collaborate by having PhD students or learning about each other's work. And they currently have a workshop on building back better for mental health. So we've had big discussions about, you know, where is the intersection of well-being, mental health, mental illness, and people coming from different perspectives, you know, historians, philosophers, people who study education. So it's really, I think, you know, there's a lot of things that were difficult with the pandemic, but at least post-pandemic, there seems to be a new drive for people for collaboration and face-to-face interaction and a bit more, you know, social aspect of the science as well.
It's brilliant that, you know, because we, I say we, but like people who maybe have been affected by mental health, and a lot of the times when you're really down and you start to believe that like you're the only one and there's no one out to help you and stuff, but then you realize that there's people outside of your sphere like studying this and trying to find ways to, because serotonin is another interesting thing because people we'll talk about it. I've heard people dismiss it and stuff as not something that's been affected by you know, by depression and stuff like that. And we've obviously talked about medication and stuff like that. And I'll always stand for what has helped me, and I can't say what would help someone else. But to have people like yourself and the people we work with looking after that kind of that side of things is very important, and it gives us a bit of hope as well. I think that's another thing, you know, because it's one thing, like we say, going to therapists, but there has to be, you know, people digging deeper as well to find out the reasons and how we can help it. But I wanted to actually ask you about that of the last 2 years, because how did the last 2 years just on a personal level affect your memory and your learning?
Yeah, I think I was one of the lucky ones that had a garden. So
okay, good.
I loved just sitting outside. I was able to work, in fairness, because I can do a lot of my teaching and analysis and stuff on a laptop. But in terms of animal experiments, we're still classified as medical preclinical research, they call it. So we were allowed to go in and work. But I think I learned a new word from all the, you know, everyone was doing these online quizzes. So I think in terms of memory, I learned some useless information.
Okay.
Such as a taphophile is someone who loves graveyards. And I think I became a taphophile.
Taphophile. What a great word that is.
Because I kind of walked, I did a lot of walking. You know, we're allowed our once a day exercise, and nearby me there were some interesting graveyards where I was living in Cambridge. So I was walking around those, which sounds really morbid, but actually was nice to get out, walk around, and you kind of realize, well, we all end up in the same place at
Yeah,
some point
this is true.
or another. So I think I mean, as a lot of people, I probably found that it was interesting because I was lucky. I was living with two women that I got on really well with in a house share, so I still had the social kind of aspect. I wasn't completely alone. But I noticed that like a lot of people that I might have only spoken to at Christmas and stuff, like friends from Waterford and stuff, because we were all getting used to Zoom and everything. Yeah, we were having these quizzes online or talking to each other online. So in a way, it did actually create a bit of an opportunity for people to get back in touch with people they hadn't spoken to in a while or something, because globally everyone was to different extents but experiencing a similar situation, you know.
I found it less stressful and less anxious, or sorry, less anxiety, because there was no pressure on you to kind of go somewhere, and you know, there was always when I'm really bad, like I'll hope for an excuse will come up that I can get out of something, but the excuse was ready made, so I was very much more relaxed and stuff like that. But I guess I did kind of notice that the reason I said about memory, and it was I think my memory suffered a little bit with it, like just with regards to I guess like social, you know what I mean, just being able to interact like I'd normally interact. I was a little bit off, and every time I went into, then when the anxiety had to increase when I did have to go into like a place, like to get buy something, that the whole idea of having to meet someone was just, oh God, I hope I don't, because I've forgotten all my social norms and graces and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can imagine as well with the masks and everything. Like we had so many, like you say, a shift in people's expectations, because some people were very risk averse, you know, and didn't want to touch anything that anyone had touched, whereas other people would have been very relaxed and like, oh, you know, we're outside, it's fine. So it added this whole level of social boundaries that were different. I felt one benefit as well from my work was, as much as it was awful in the beginning, I mean, you're a pro with, you know, your setup. We had to move from teaching and lecturing in person to recording things online, and then watching myself back and my hands, how much they move, things like this. So that was quite a dramatic change, but I actually think that was really great. I think going forward, just the opportunity for students to have recordings of lectures to watch back, and you know, I think that's actually been a dramatic change in how we teach that was probably long overdue.
For sure. I think like self-analysis has definitely gone up since we all went on Zoom. I think we're just so conscious of like, why do I, and that's why I'm so focused when I'm on the podcast. I never look at my side of the screen ever, because if you do, you go, why is that gray hair? And it's actually sticking out there. That's what happens when you look, you know. But anyway, that's not the point. But I would just with regards to memory as well. Like, so I'm 39 now, and I have noticed that when I'm speaking to someone, I used to be so great at like films and music and names of people and stuff like that. And it's just starting to. I'm not worried, by the way. This is just a question I'm putting out there. Like it's a weird thing, but I guess it's a normal thing.
I wonder if it's something. I'm not sure we know exactly why this happens, but I think one of the ideas might be that it's something called proactive interference, that you have accumulated so much knowledge and information that when you try and actually learn something new, it kind of is competing with the old stuff. So as Homer Simpson put it, you know, basically when you learn something new, it pushes out the old things.
Pretty much.
In a very simplistic way. That is one of the ideas. And it works the other way as well. You can have like a retroactive one where you're trying to learn like for example, a language, and another language just keeps coming to mind when you're trying to capture the word. So it could be that we just get too much interference.
But yeah, I guess, and it's funny. Carl Pilkington, another, you know, what would you call him? A great mind of his time, mentioned that about when something comes in, something goes out, and people kind of laughed at him. But you know, maybe it's not so. You know, it's not so out there. So, what do you like to do in your spare time, Emma?
I'm big into music. Okay. So I have that I don't have it as a record. I'm actually still, I have CDs, which I think
So
is
do I. Don't worry about
mad.
that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
like music, going to gigs. Not a particularly good guitarist, but I do play for
Oh,
fun.
good. Good.
Yeah, and I try anything once. I I like drawing too. I've always been like, you know, painting, drawing things.
What kind is that like? Is it, a bowl of fruit, or is it more landscape?
Anything.
Anything. Okay.
Anything. I kind of try and do something different.
Hmm.
So with a friend, actually, this grew out, I think, during lockdown, because I had a friend who also, she said, oh, I wish, I was good at drawing when I was younger. I'd like to take it up again. And I said, well, why don't we just set each other a prompt? We just Google,
Yeah.
just some random words, and then give ourselves 2 weeks. And then we send a picture on WhatsApp, say, what have you drawn? And just kind of motivate each other
Yeah.
to do it regularly. And I think I've definitely got better from doing it regularly. But I think,
It's great.
yeah, just stuff like that. Same with in Bristol. I'm in like an album club where you meet and talk about albums.
Okay, so now
Yeah.
that's a great idea. But now that you've mentioned it, because this is a thing that I've kind of started bringing in. So people mention films or music. I have to ask them, if they had one album to listen to, only one album for the rest of their lives, what would it be?
Oh, like Desert Island Discs.
Yeah, kind of like Desert Island Discs, but you're just allowed the one album.
Yeah, I've tried to think about this before, and I think one of my favorites, I love John Martin's album Solid Air. I really love it. It's
He's
just
brilliant guitarist, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant guitarist, and just there's a lot of variety in it as well, and sort of, yeah, the lyrics are kind of cool. In terms of like music related to neuroscience, there is a song that I really love by a kind of a jazz singer called Kurt Elling, called Samurai Cowboy. So you wouldn't get an
No,
idea from the title.
you won't forget that name though.
Yeah, but that song, he's kind of talking about running and kind of something changing in your brain, and I don't even know if he says brain. I think he says Scully Hutch or something. But like that song really, for me, I was like, this sounds like he's talking about neuroscience in a weird way.
Yeah.
So I love that tune. Yeah.
Do you know, when you talk about music, and music is such a huge thing for people, and we've discussed a bit about Alzheimer's and dementia, and how people seem to remember connections to music and things like that. I think it's such a powerful thing. Was Oliver Sacks a neuroscientist?
Yeah, he was a clinical doctor, so I think he may have been a neurologist, like meaning he could actually know more about fixing the brain than just sort of understanding how it works. But yeah, he has a great book, Musicophilia, which Why Humans Are Wired. I have read it and I really enjoyed it, but I think what you're talking about there about memory for music and memory for lyrics is something I find really interesting. Like, why can we remember lyrics so well? And I wonder sometimes if it's linked to language, if maybe the evolution of language, did we start with sounds and music, and that's why it goes in better, or is it the rhythm and the patterns or something that helps it? And maybe someone who's an expert in language would probably know this really quickly, but I think it is fascinating, isn't it, how strong it can be? And like you say, you've got the example of awakenings with the patients being able to dance when they hear familiar music. Yeah.
Well, it's even what you said about Samurai Cowboy, like your how you interpret the song, and you can see it as in relation to you. And I think that's like, I understand, like, you've described very well what the music part of it is, but the lyrics is great as well, because the songs that I grew up with, it seems, I shouldn't say I will, but it seems like I'll never forget the lyrics as soon as I come on the lyrics. But I've already drawn parallels between the lyrics and my life, or something that's related to my life, or like, oh God, that was my first girlfriend and mine song. You know what I mean? And you'll never break away from that. And I wonder, is that part of it? I'm sure it is part of the reason why people who have, unfortunately, who have Alzheimer's, dementia, are still able to cling on to music and hear the same stuff as they did when they were young. But it's a beautiful thing that it can, because of the power of that art form.
Yeah, and it's so, as you say, exactly, the kind of the ability of it to also be subjective is really cool. I guess maybe people would say the same thing for images and painting and stuff, but I don't know. But yeah, same thing. And I find it funny that sometimes you can associate a certain band or something with a person. They become tied to that individual,
Yeah.
and then you hear that music and it reminds you of them.
Yeah.
So it's intertwined really strongly.
It is, yeah, it's amazing. But so would you have? I obviously mentioned Oliver Sacks. Would you have a favorite book, about neuroscience?
Oh yeah, to be honest, I have a few, and I don't tend to read them because it's a bit. If I'm reading something outside of work, I tend to read something non-neurosciencey. But
Yeah.
there's one, my dad actually recommended one to me called Flowers for Algernon.
Okay.
And what was the name of the author? I can't remember the name of the author, but I really loved it. It's a really good story about a guy. It's written like a diary.
Right.
And he writes in really bad grammar and poor English. And it's a person that has, a low IQ. And the story of the book is that he undergoes an experiment to increase his intelligence. And Algernon is this mouse that goes through the same experiment. I think it's from like the 60s, this book. And it follows how he sort of becomes super intelligent, and it's talking about loneliness and fitting in and stuff like that. It's a really good story.
Do you know what? That reminds me of the plot for the film from the late 60s, early 70s called Charlie.
Oh yeah, maybe they
it?
made a film about it. Yeah.
If I'll go after this, I'll go and have a look. But like Charlie was, I can't remember the guy who played the lead role, but he won an Oscar for it. But it's that idea that he had a lower IQ, and he became a kind of an experiment, and they went through it, and I think it's Cliff Robertson anyway. But they go through this experiment, and he becomes very, very intelligent. And it seems like it must be.
It must be. They must have made the movie. Oh, it's cool. I haven't seen that. I'll check that out.
I actually have. Well, unfortunately you're in Bristol, but I have it on. I actually got it on DVD. I went through this thing where I was buying all the Oscar-winning films, and that was one. It's an actually pretty decent film, but maybe it's dated a bit. But I'd be definitely interested in reading the book. I'll have a look. Listen, Emma, if someone wants to follow your work, is there any way they can do that?
Yeah, I have a web page at Bristol Uni. So if you Google me, Emma Cahill. I use my middle name Nuala as well, because there's quite a few Emma Cahills on the internet.
Oh, tell me, no, tell us about. No, you got to mention this now, because we talked about it before. Who's the most famous Emma Cahill on the internet?
The Google hit at the moment is the lady that has the biggest feet in Europe. But I didn't also tell you that there's also a country singer from Ireland called Emma Cahill, who has a never-ending love for you, is her country song, which is,
not as interesting as the feet, though. It's the feet.
So I'm competing with quite a few. So I never thought I'd use my middle name.
No.
But so one good thing about having one. So it's used there. And I put my access to, my papers and stuff are very scientific, but I often share stuff on Twitter too. So I'm Dr. Emma Cahill on Twitter.
Dr. Emma Cahill on Twitter. I forgot actually to mention the reason I brought up Oliver Sacks was there's my favorite book of his is The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and the stories that go with the different patients he speaks to. It's a fascinating book. Emma, it's been a pleasure and very informative chatting to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been great.
Thank you. Listen, if you wouldn't mind sticking with me for a minute, I'll close this out and I'll get a quick photograph for the Instagram and all that. Like, we got to keep up with that. Yeah. Thanks, Emma. I also want to thank John for the tech side of stuff, and Nathan for promotion. And the usual people. I always thank the same people: my mum, my dad, my granddad, Jaron Calvin. My granddad, actually, I didn't mention this in the last episode, or maybe it was. Oh, no, it was. He was 95 a couple of weeks ago, and he's still going, and he's an absolute legend. Subscribe to our YouTube if you would. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, Apple Anchor, Google Podcasts, etc. Thanks everyone for tuning in today's episode. And Emma, once again, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we will see you next week. Bye.